A warning to all listeners that this podcast will discuss residential and day schools and contain sensitive and distressing information. For those experiencing intergenerational trauma or are triggered by the following information, the Residential School Survivors Society can be contacted toll-free at 1-800-721-0066. That's 1-800-721-0066. And a 24-hour National Residential School Crisis Line can also be contacted at 1-866-925-4419. Again, that's 1-866-925-4419. Segon, ani bojo. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode. I'm Hannah, a Ganyakahaga woman working as a summer student for the United Church of Canada's Canadian Shield Regional Council's Right Relations team. Today, I'm going to be tackling a few common misconceptions surrounding residential and day schools. If this is your first time tuning in, I definitely suggest listening to our first episode before listening to this one. It provides some much-needed background and context for today's discussion. But without any further ado, let's get into it. 1. Not every school was bad. While some survivors have talked about having a relatively good experience at their school, this is not the case for the majority. The schools overall were a breeding ground for widespread emotional, mental, physical, and sexual abuse. It's also important to keep in mind that even at the schools that didn't experience as much abuse, death, or neglect, every school under the system was created with the intent to assimilate and colonize Indigenous children. Because of these foundational principles, none of these institutions should be branded as good. 2. But Indigenous communities asked for the schools to be built. First off, I need to point out that this is an example of victim blaming, which is a pervasive belief that in 2023, no one should ascribe to. I believe this misconception comes from the fact that many of the numbered treaties which were signed between 1871 to 1921 had clauses for schools in order to educate their children. However, how were Indigenous communities to know or predict the atrocities that would happen at these schools? Communities were hoping for academic education so that their children could succeed in the up-and-coming Canadian society. They did not ask for the children to be removed from their communities, stripped of their culture, or abused by the teachers that were meant to look after their children. 3. But the term cultural genocide is too severe. I don't think it is. Duncan Campbell Scott, the Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs between 1913 to 1932, was quoted as saying, "I want to get rid of the Indian problem. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department." Cultural genocide is defined as the systematic destruction of traditions, values, language, and other elements that make one group of people distinct from another. The residential school system was created to do just that. Children that practiced their traditions or spoke their home language were often punished. But even more, it is widely recognized by Indigenous groups that residential schools were a form of genocide, period. This was even accepted by the House of Commons in October 2022. According to the UN definition of genocide, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. A. Killing members of the group. We know that over 4,100 children died at the schools. B. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. We know that there was widespread physical, emotional, mental, and sexual abuse at the schools. C. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. We know that many of the facilities and buildings were not suitable for habitation, as is seen in the numerous inspections of the institutions. D. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. We know that at some schools, including at Albany Indian Residential School, which the United Church ran, survivors have told stories that if the girls became pregnant, they were forced to undergo abortions and sometimes were involuntarily sterilized. And forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. We know that the children were forcibly removed from their communities in an attempt to assimilate them into white Christian society. So, as it seems, cultural genocide actually isn't a harsh enough term for the residential school system. 4. But they were learning valuable skills. The majority of these schools were teaching farming and house skills, and for the most part, they did not focus as much attention on academic education. While these skills could be considered valuable, it's important to recognize that they attended these schools with the hopes that they would follow the provincial curriculums, and it was not expected that the children would be subject to forced labor for hours upon hours every day. As well, there were circumstances enforced by the government that limited Indigenous peoples from having success in agriculture. When reserves were created, they were often located on land that was less suitable for farming. However, some Indigenous farmers were able to find success regardless of the land fertility. And in response, the government created a permit system which meant Indigenous farmers were prohibited from selling farming goods without a permit. Settlers were also not allowed to buy products from Indigenous farmers. But also, the purchasing of farm machinery had to be approved by Indian agents, and in some cases, in order to gain permission from an Indian agent, they would have to travel many days by foot. Keep in mind, they would have no idea if the agent was even home. If an Indigenous farmer gained a permit and was hoping to sell their products, they were further restricted by the pass system. The pass system meant that Indigenous peoples could not leave their reserve without a pass from their Indian agent. With all these restrictions piled together, it made it hard for many Indigenous farmers to actually succeed in agriculture. So for those children at residential schools that might have been returning to their home reserve after graduation, these skills were less valuable for those hoping to make money from farming. 5. But they could return to their communities after. But many of these children couldn't. Over 4,100 children died, with some estimating that the number of deaths is closer to 6,000. These children would never get the opportunity to return home. Some children were also forced to attend an institute that was very far away from their community, and with no money or ability to find transportation back to their homes after graduation, many of these children would never be able to return to their community. And many of those children who were able to return home felt out of place on the reserve. Remember, they were stripped of their language and culture. 6. But it happened so long ago. The last residential school closed in 1996, and the last day school was transferred to community control in 2000. Both of these events happened less than 30 years ago. 7. But apologies were made. While apologies have been issued by the United, Presbyterian, Anglican, Missionary Oblates of Mary Immaculate, and Roman Catholic churches, and the federal government did apologize in 2008, these apologies have not been accepted by Indigenous communities and organizations. This is because communities are waiting for these institutions to live up to the apology. Words only mean so much. Action is what will make these apologies more genuine and appreciated. And 8. But can Indigenous people just move on? This is an incredibly pervasive belief that comes from a place of extreme privilege. All Indigenous people are affected by the legacy of residential and day schools, whether they had a parent, grandparent, great-grandparent, aunt, uncle, cousin, or they themselves attended one of these schools. It is also acknowledged that Indigenous communities are experiencing high levels of intergenerational trauma. If you don't know what intergenerational trauma is, it is exactly what it sounds like, trauma that is passed down through generations. It's important to remember that the behavior we see as children from the adults in our lives has a huge impact on how we form relationships with our partners, our kids, our friends, and many others. Children as young as 4 attended these institutes, where many witnessed or experienced extreme abuse and neglect. This happened in their most formative years. Of course it would affect their adulthood. This is why, according to Amy Bombay, an associate professor at Dalhousie University who studies intergenerational trauma, survivors of the institutes are at higher risk of health problems such as heart disease and diabetes, and social conditions such as homelessness and substance abuse. There's also high levels of mental illness in survivors. This trauma is then passed to future generations in a variety of ways. For instance, there is research to suggest that trauma literally affects a person's DNA, and this will be passed down for generations. This is why there are harrowing statistics in Indigenous communities, such as the fact that suicide and self-inflicted injuries are the leading causes of death for First Nations people up to 44 years old. Or that for First Nations, the suicide rate is 3 times the national average. For Métis, it is twice the national average, and for Inuit, it is 9 times the national average. Indigenous people cannot simply get over what many settlers have the privilege to see as a historical event, because the legacy of residential schools continues to affect communities today and will affect communities for generations. This is why action on the part of churches and the federal government is integral in the healing of Indigenous communities. Next episode, I'm going to be exploring the United Church of Canada's apologies, the apologies from other institutions that participated in the residential school system, and why these apologies were not accepted. Once more, for those experiencing intergenerational trauma or are triggered by the information in this podcast, the Residential School Survivors Society can be contacted toll-free at 1-800-721-0066. That's 1-800-721-0066. And a 24-hour National Residential School Crisis Line can also be contacted at 1-866-925-4419. Again, that's 1-866-925-4419. Nyawa, Jimmy Gwetch, thank you for listening.